now on Facebook, and I don't understand all those things, but we're on there. And I know Katrina and Mike are gone to Houston, Texas today, and Katrina told me to give her a shout out on Facebook. So Katrina, here's your shout out on Facebook. So when she looks at it, everybody can yell and say hi. But we are thrilled, and if you have the opportunity, look at it during the week and post it and repost it, and then maybe a lot of people will see it. It's a great opportunity for an outreach, to be able to take the message into people's homes who, we might never know who they are, but we may do a lot of good through that. And so we look forward to this, and we appreciate the Oaks sisters as they continue to take care of everything that we are doing along these lines. For the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about this concept of change that we really began last week. We're going to be looking at some different passages, different stories in the book of Acts, ways in which people were changed. And we're going to look at different aspects of that. Today we're going to look at a different aspect of it. But as we begin, I want you to picture yourself in a small boat in the middle of the ocean. And you can't see land on any side. Everywhere that you look around you, all you see is water. And in this small boat, you get a hole in your boat. Water starts rushing in. You immediately look and you search for a bucket. And you grab that bucket and you begin to bail. And that works pretty well for a little while, as you bail the water out and you keep the boat from sinking with that. But as you grow tired, as you grow disgruntled, as you find more problems, you decide, I have to do something else. And so you begin to look around in the boat to see what you can use to possibly fix your boat. Fix that hole. I think this is so much like life itself. We are all people who are looking for a way to fix our lives. We're looking for a way to complete the puzzles that our lives are. And as we search sometimes, instead of us fixing the problems that are in our lives, or fixing the things that bother us in our lives, we tend to be people who just continue to bail, who continue to throw out this or that. And as I said, that works for a while. But pretty soon we have to decide to fix our boat. I hope you see there's a great spiritual application to this. As you look at your life, you may see your life in a lot of different aspects. You may see your life as a spiritual part of something that is just not where you want it to be. Maybe you've never been baptized. Maybe you've never really committed. Maybe you've never really put on everything that you needed to do to make your relationship with God what it needs to be. This morning, as we begin this lesson, I want you to focus on fixing your spiritual life. Whatever you find in need, I want you to do that. Now, as you and I begin to get ready, I want you to turn this morning. We're going to be looking in Acts the 16th chapter. We're going to be talking about a conversion story. And if you remember, we talked about that Jesus tells us, he says, unless you change and become like a little child, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. So this morning, what we are going to do is we're going to talk about that change, but we're going to talk about different types of changes. If you would pick up in Acts the 16th chapter, in the 25th verse. It's a very famous story in Acts the 16th chapter, the 25th verse. It's the story that we often refer to as the story of the Philippian jailer. It is one that many of you are so familiar with that you could almost quote it. But in Acts 16:25, Paul and Silas had been placed in prison in the city of Philippi. And now we pick up in verse 25. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once all the prison doors flew open, and everybody's chains came loose. Now the situation is Paul and Silas are in jail. And as they are in jail, they are singing and praising the Lord, and them and all the prisoners that were there. And suddenly there's a great earthquake. We went to California a few years ago, and every morning when I got up, the first thing I said is, Lord, I'm thankful we didn't have an earthquake last night. I haven't been around a lot of different earthquakes, but I can remember so well one time I was stripping tobacco at a Dareville in the stripping room, and I had a bottle with a little bit of water and stuff in it that was sitting up in the window. And as I was stripping that, I looked up and I looked at that bottle, and that bottle was moving. Got home, found out we'd had an earthquake. I'm really sort of glad I didn't know we were having an earthquake when I looked at the bottle moving, because I might have thought it was going to be worse. But you can't run from an earthquake. You can't hide from an earthquake. I wonder sometimes if we have earthquakes in our lives. We have something that moves us so much that we're unable to hide from it. I think so often what we do is we fail to deal with the problems that arise in life, and maybe we even fail to deal with the earthquakes that come. Maybe we fail to deal with the storms that come. And we're like the man who was in the boat, and all we do is continue to bail, and we never try to fix the problem. But here in Philippi, as Paul and Silas are in jail and they're singing, a great earthquake occurs. And the earthquake is so strong that all at once all the prison doors flew open. And everyone's chains came loose. Can you imagine what it would be like to be in the middle of a Roman jail, and suddenly an earthquake comes, and the doors, the inner and the outer doors, they fly open, and the chains which had been around you, they fall off. And you know, a guy like me would look at that and say, that's a sign I need to run. It's time for me to get out of here. And it would have been an appropriate thing, probably. But it wouldn't have been what God intended for them. I want you to pick up in verse 29 now. Now in verse 27. The jailer woke up, and when he saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, because he thought the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourself. We are all here." Now when the jailer hears this, and one of the things that occurred in Roman jails especially was that the jailer lived in the jail. And as he was there in the jail and he saw the earthquake that occurred, he rushes to see about it. And when he sees all the doors are open, when he sees that the chains are no longer holding anyone, he becomes extremely upset. So upset that what he does is he decides, I'm going to take my sword and kill myself. But then out of the darkness, he hears Paul. And Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourself. We are all here." You know, I said a moment ago that most prisoners would run. But most prisoners were not like Paul and Silas. You see, their main purpose was to preach. Their main purpose was to teach. And whether they were in jail or they were down by the sea or they were by the riverside, whether they were in the synagogue or on the side of a hill in Athens, Paul took the opportunity to preach. And do you know, at this time, there was someone who was ready to listen. And that one who was ready to listen is the jailer himself. You see, this jailer was so upset that he had even thought about killing himself. He drew his sword. He thought all the prisoners were gone. He thought that he'd lost his job and that he was going to even have to serve out the prison sentences of all the prisoners who were there. He thought that he might be executed by the Roman authorities because he'd allowed them to escape. And so he decided to end it right then. Do you realize that if Paul and Silas had run, they wouldn't have been there to have stopped the Philippian jailer from killing himself? But because they stayed, they have tremendous results. The jailer was ready for a change in his life, even if he'd lost his life. And now, as he hears from the voice inside, he changes the way in which he responds. I want you to pick up in verse 29. The jailer called for lights, rushed in, and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. He then brought them out and asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" Isn't it amazing that the jailer sees there's something totally different here? And so he cries out, "What must I do to be saved? What do I need to do to change my life? What do I need to do to have the kind of faith that you have? That you did not run when the opportunity came. What must I do? What must I do?" Before anyone is actually converted, they always have to reach the point in their life where they say that very thing. What must I do? What do I need to do? It's something that we see over and over in the book of Acts. Even on the day of Pentecost, the people cried out, "What must we do?" to Peter and the other apostles. Here they cried out, "What must I do?" as the jailer looks for what he needs. You and I need to be people who are constantly asking the question, what do I need? What do I need? In verse 31, they replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved, you and your household." Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all the others in his house. At that hour of the night, the jailer took them and washed their wounds. Then immediately he and all his family were baptized. Isn't it wonderful when you see a story that has such a tragic part to it? And an earthquake always has a tragic part. Someone who considers suicide has a tragic part. But it turns out for good, because there was someone there to help them. Because Paul and Silas had remained. When he asked what must he do, the words come, you must believe. You must believe in Jesus Christ. You have to build that faith. You have to be someone who understands. And so at that very moment, he takes them and he begins to administer to their wounds. He feeds them. And then he put on Christ in baptism. And he had his sins washed away. So that instead of being corrupted, he could be cleansed. What a beautiful thing that is, and what a beautiful picture it is as we see in the rubble the unfolding of salvation. The giving of life where there would have been death. Excuse me. And then in the very next verse, in verse 34, the jailer brought them into his house and set a meal before them. He was filled with joy because he had come to believe in God, he and his whole family. I want you to see the final thought about the Philippian jailer. He was someone who had asked what he needed to do. And when he believed and was baptized and had his sins washed away, not only him, but his entire family. And now he was filled with joy. Filled with joy. This morning, what would you choose? Would you choose to be happy or would you choose to be sad? Would you choose to be despondent or would you choose to rejoice? I know that every one of us is going to answer that question with joy. With joy. That we might have that happiness. And the only real happiness comes in believing in Jesus. It comes in putting him on in baptism, in serving him, in having your sins washed away, in having the proper relationship with God. Instead of being separated from God, being united with God. And now he's filled with joy. As we close our service today, I want us to have 3 applications that come from the story of the Philippian jailer. And as we look at these 3 applications, we're going to look at another spot in the city of Philippi. We're going to look at the lesson in Philippians. And we're going to go to Philippians, the 4th chapter and the 8th verse. But as you look at this scripture, I want you to make sure that you identify with the Philippian jailer. Because of the things that happened to him and because of the joy which he had. Now in Philippians, the 4th chapter and the 8th verse. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. The very first one of these applications this morning is that I want you to change the way you do something. And I want you to change it in accordance with what it says here in Philippians. I want you to change the way you think. Change the way in which you think. I long to be someone who thinks better things. I long to be someone who thinks joyous things. I long to be someone who thinks on things that are of God. And in all of those things that were mentioned there in Philippians, the 4th chapter and the 8th verse, he says, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, think on these things. Think on these things. One of the problems that the Philippian jailer had was that he thought the worst of everyone. You see, when he goes in, he thinks the prisoners are all gone. When he goes in, he thinks he's going to be punished for it. And so now he decides in his despair to kill himself. But as we talk about change, as we talk about conversion, and we look at the story of the Philippian jailer, the very first thing he did was he changed the way he thought. This morning, we need to change the way in which we think. The Bible tells us, for as a man thinketh, so is he. Jesus commends us on the idea of having honorable thoughts. And we need to be people who think on the things of God and allow that to change our lives. The second application comes in the very next verse, in verse 9. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice. And the God of peace will be with you. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice. The second application that I want you to take is I want you to change the way you act. Because of the fact you're able to change the way you think, you can change the way in which you act. One of the things that I've gotten to where that I maybe dislike as much as anything is people who say, I can't change. I can't change. I've been this way too long and I just cannot change. But you can. Because everyone is changing all the time. As you change the way in which you think, then you begin to change the way in which you act. And those two things need to go hand in hand. That we be someone who thinks good things, and as we think good things, now we do good things. And that's exactly what Paul's telling us in the Philippian letter, here in the fourth chapter, and 8th and 9th verse. That's exactly what we saw in the life of the Philippian jailer. Even though we don't have his name, we see him become someone who thinks differently, and now he acts differently. So as you and I look at our lives, let us take those good and wonderful things that we think about and begin to act on them so that we can reach the third application. The third thing that you have to do is you have to change your relationship with God. Change your relationship with God. In the Garden of Eden, man sinned. And when man sinned, he separated himself from God. Adam and Eve had a perfect relationship where that they talked with God, they walked with God. They had everything. But when sin entered in, it changed the relationship of man with God. But God wanted us back in the proper relationship. God wanted us to belong to Him. God wanted us to be His. God wanted that complete relationship, that perfect relationship, that loving relationship. And so as it tells us in John 3:16, for God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. And so He sent His Son to die on the cross, to be the one who paid what I could not pay, who gave Himself as the perfect sacrifice so that sin could be overcome. And you know, when the Philippian jailer put him on in baptism, when he had his sins washed away, he then stood complete with the Lord. That's why he was able to have that joy that it spoke of there. Because his relationship was changed. And it becomes something much, much more wonderful. This morning, I want you to be someone who changes. And I want you to do with those three things that we've looked at. I want you to be someone who changes the way in which you think. I want you to be someone who changes the way in which you act. And I want you to change your relationship with God. I want you to have a greater faith than you've ever had. I want you to have the peace that passes understanding. I want you to have the joy that comes in belonging to God. This morning, maybe you don't have that. And maybe it's something that you need to work on and that you continue to work on. But we want to be someone that helps you. And if there is anything that we can do to help, to assist, we're always ready. And this morning, if we can help you in any way, won't you come as we stand and sing?